Welcome to Built, Wired, and Secured. I'm Alex Morgan. In today's episode, we're discussing redundancy theater, designing failover that actually works, what it is, why it matters, and what decision makers need to know to avoid costly mistakes. Joining me today is Michael Harrington as we break down real-world lessons, common challenges, and practical takeaways you can apply immediately. Let's dive in.
Cold open. A multi-tenant office building loses internet and some critical building controls during a midday storm. The spec said 2 independent internet feeds and mirrored network hardware. Yet within minutes, tenants' point-of-sale terminals go dark, access control panels stop responding, and elevators default to a backup mode that slows traffic to a crawl. The on-site team watches redundant lights and mirrored gear, but nothing restores service because the 2 feeds shared the same underground conduit, and the switchover scripts had never been executed under load. Tenants lose revenue, facilities scramble, and everyone learns the same lesson. Redundancy on paper is not resilience in practice.
What we'll cover in 10 minutes, how to tell real redundancy from theater, and 3 immediate checks you can run on any project or existing system to reveal fragile backups. Before we jump into specifics, a little context. Redundancy decisions are made across facilities, IT, procurement, and sometimes the tenant community. Each group has different priorities: cost, uptime, maintainability, and those priorities shape how redundancy is specified and accepted. Too often, procurement writes a checkbox requirement, engineering selects mirrored hardware, and operations is left to prove it actually works under real conditions.
Let's start with the anatomy of false redundancy. Too many so-called backups hide shared dependencies. A second UPS in the same room, duplicate switches on the same power strip, or 2 fiber routes that both run through the same manhole. You read the spec and say, redundant path in place, but you didn't ask what breaks if this goes down. And that question finds the shared points immediately. Another common failure is untested switchover logic. Systems will sit for months or years without a full end-to-end failover drill. Components may mimic redundancy, but rely on manual steps or scripts that were never executed past factory defaults. Then there are human process single points. One technician knows how the vendor customizations work, or only one access card opens critical panels. That's redundant in hardware, but not operationally redundant.
Can you share an anonymized example where systems looked redundant but failed when needed?
Sure. I worked on a campus where the telecom team had contracted 2 carriers for diversity. On paper, it was perfect, path A and path B. In practice, both carriers terminated at the same IDF because the site drawings weren't updated and the new conduit they both used hadn't been inspected. When a construction crew cut that single conduit, both feeds dropped at once. Tenants called the property manager asking why the promised redundancy didn't help. From an operational standpoint, that was a failure of coordination and verification, not a failure of carriers.
That leads us to trade-offs and prioritization. Owners are balancing capital and operating budgets against risk. How do you decide where to invest in full redundancy versus acceptable partial redundancy?
Start by mapping impact. Which services cause immediate tenant harm when they fail? Tenants feel this immediately with elevators, HVAC for critical floors, point of sale, or access control. For those services, full physical and logical separation is worth the cost. For lower impact systems, partial redundancy, faster recovery processes, local spares, or rapid vendor SLAs can be acceptable. And when you set SLAs, don't just ask for redundant. Specify measurable outcomes, mean time to recover, allowable downtime per year, and acceptable performance during failover. That way, you can verify performance against objective criteria.
What does a realistic acceptance criterion look like in a contract or construction acceptance test?
Make it outcome-focused and testable. Examples. On loss of primary feed, secondary feed must sustain full tenant traffic within X seconds and maintain packet loss below Y% for Z minutes. Or, upon utility power loss, on-site generator will support life safety loads within 30 seconds and critical HVAC zones within 60 seconds. Combine those with a defined test procedure and acceptable pass-fail metrics. If you can script the test and measure it with simple tools, you remove ambiguity and reduce vendor hand-waving.
Let's move from acceptance to routine operations. How do teams operationalize resilience so redundancy stays real and doesn't degrade into theater?
3 practical steps. First, codify realistic failover drills into your commissioning and maintenance calendar. Run them end-to-end at least annually and after any significant change. Second, define ownership for each failure mode. Who calls who owns the rollback, and who notifies tenants. Third, instrument your tests so results are repeatable. Timestamps, logs, and measured service impact. Document lessons and turn them into configuration baselines. From an operational standpoint, that paperwork and those test artifacts are gold when it's time to renew contracts or defend a budget request. A short drill example. Schedule an off-peak window, simulate primary path loss, observe failover, record time to restore, and any manual interventions required. If a vendor has to run a 45-minute console script to restore service, that's a process risk. Factor that into your SLA and staffing plans. That's fine until it fails, and when it does, tenants feel it immediately.
Okay, for listeners who need immediate practical next steps, let's summarize key takeaways and give a short checklist they can use today. Key takeaways. Quick checklist you can apply now. 1. Map dependencies end-to-end. Physical paths, power, network, and human roles. 2. Define measurable acceptance criteria and test them during commissioning. 3. Establish routine, documented failover drills and ownership. And 3 questions to ask on your next project that reveal redundancy theater. Do both paths traverse separate physical routes? Can the backup restore service under production load within an agreed time? And who is responsible, and do they have the access and training to execute the failover?
If I can add one final operational point, make verification part of procurement. Require vendors to demonstrate failover in situ as a condition of final acceptance. If you can't see a measurable demonstration, reserve final payment until you can. That aligns incentives and reduces the chance that redundancy remains a paper promise.
That wraps up this episode of Built, Wired, and Secured. Today we explored designing redundancy that actually works and why testable, outcome-focused criteria matter to the people responsible for planning, operating, and protecting technology environments. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us. For templates, acceptance criteria examples, and a downloadable redundancy checklist, visit gds.technology/redundancy-checklist. Until next time, make sure the systems you're responsible for are built to last, wired with intention, and secured for the real world. Built to last, wired with intention, secured for the real world.